And welcome everyone to Concourse Connect episode 2, where we are focusing on effective building of cloud governance for security as code programs for the enterprise. We're super happy to have you all here with us today as we continue to explore our learnings and experience and share with you how we've helped clients and institutions build a strong security as code program. So just to jump right in, I think as we did in the first episode, we think probably worth just spending a couple of moments just to baseline on the definition of security as code as we see it. And there's a lot of different points of view out there. There's lots of different interpretations, but fundamentally, we really look at security as code as having three fundamental components. The first being that it really is code. It's about the instantiation of declarative artifacts that take your controls and implement them in a codified manner so they can be repeatable, they can be scalable, and they can be deployed in many different places. Second, which is a very important part of the security as code program, is that really defining those controls is an incredibly important part of the process of actually formalizing your risk objectives, formalizing what types of controls you want to move into a codified structure, and then converting them and implementing them into version software. So both the software itself, as well as the process and the creation, if you would, of a formalized registry or catalog of control objectives and their related implementations. And then lastly, we very much look at security as code as following the basic value proposition of infrastructure as code, which we think, and expect many of you have experience with, really the ability to move into an idempotent structure to support the scalability and repeatability of your business over time, encapsulating the expertise and knowledge into software. And really, as we said before, kind of thinking about that not just from the perspective of how you deploy applications to the cloud, but how you ultimately over time build, curate, and maintain and manage a collection of controls and security to ensure that they're safe, that they're operating in the way that you need and the way that you expect. So that's our definition of security as code from a basic perspective. Why is this important? We spent a lot of time on this in the first episode, but just to highlight, the main points here, that when you kind of move from on-premise to cloud, that, the fundamental changes that are occurring both in the inherent security requirements and needs of your applications, being in a public versus a private environment, moving from a control model where a lot of the kind of network control points can be managed through firewalls and hardware into an environment that is much more fundamentally open, where the ability to kind of define and create perimeters is going to be different, as well as just the base complexity and speed at which the cloud moves. So many more services, a lot faster rate of change, the desire to empower more people in your organization to play a broader role, and therefore, with that, often the need for more people in the organizations to be participating in what becomes the overall security program and governance framework for your institution. So we see all of this as pretty fundamental for many institutions, and really requiring, in many cases, a rethink, and where most institutions that we've seen have really begun to lead towards is this perspective that the security as code movement is an essential and critical part of their strategy, that it becomes almost physics in complicated environments, that the ability to maintain human-based kind of introspection or management of change breaks down substantially at the scale and velocity of the cloud, and shifting all of that into what becomes a security as code program and architecture and implementation for institutions has become an essential part of being able to support the ability to move into public cloud and hybrid cloud architecture in a scalable way. So that's kind of the basics. In the first episode as well, we had kind of outlined what we've seen at Concourse as really the three fundamental pillars in establishing a security as code program. The first being really focusing on governance and ownership and accountability. We're going to do a deep dive in this episode into that space. The second being able to really manage the kind of implementation of your code artifacts in a way that supports the ability to maintain coherency and support the ability to associate them back to your control catalogs. We'll probably cover that in the next episode in more depth. And then lastly, the ability to leverage this entire program to really extensively and comprehensively integrate controls on an event basis into all aspects of your environment. But as we said today, we're going to really focus on this session on the governance aspect and having the ability to establish control and accountability. And I'd start by saying it is one of the most important things that we've seen in both success and failure stories in migrating and building a cloud program and a security as code program for cloud, that if thinking about and ensuring that you can create the basis for establishment of cross-company ownership for your program is essential. Having the ability to really ensure that you can create a trusted environment where the ability to trust that the software that's being used to protect your most important information and digital assets is absolutely essential. And again, in a complex, multi-cloud environment, that becomes critical that it's underpinned by a very well-defined governance program, a well-defined set of roles and accountabilities, and also, an important topic as we will get into this, which is just ultimately in complex organizations, the ability to manage also just the fact that there may be many different people that will be responsible for different parts of your overall control strategy and your security strategy. So the ability to support the concept of jurisdictions from a governance perspective becomes increasingly important. So just going a bit deeper into this conversation. So as we look at the important thing that we think is the most important message in some ways of this episode will be, when most people think about security as code, they often think about this as a technological decision point. Do I pick this programming language? Which type of technology do I want to choose? And at the end of the day, as we mentioned, when you look at the kind of need to support across a complex enterprise and get to a trusted model for ensuring that your software that's implementing your controls is working, that we often find, again, that the ability to define governance up front, to really start with that fundamental basis of how am I going to manage this problem over time as it increases in both complexity. Every piece of software we write, including security as code implementations that are software, are going to have a full life cycle behind them. How do I know it's been working, tested? How do I know the provenance of who built it? What was it built for? What's its intended, its intended use case? And how do I know that it's in a place and it's being used where it's needed? So all these aspects of really establishing a strong governance framework we see as an essential component of the ability to build a trusted and scalable security as code program. One of the first things that we see, though, is often when we talk about even just this question of how do you define answers to those questions, who is responsible for policy in my organization? What are the types of policies I need to be looking at to kind of get into that model of both verifying them, getting them cataloged, starting the process of getting them implemented is just a really hard problem. And particularly in larger organizations, this kind of digitization of governance and this digitization of the responsibilities and the controls is usually a very difficult place to start. And so first thing we really focus on and advise people to do is just start small and expand. So ensure that you're building and have a well-defined governance program and governance collection of roles and responsibilities and access-based controls, but start in a way that you really kind of take one piece of the problem, begin to focus there. So establish structure, define maybe for one of your applications or for one area of your business, some of these kind of fundamental questions of who is responsible for the policy for that, whether it be the security policy, whether it be other forms of policies, which are the cloud components that are in scope for this particular, part of my business that I'm going to start with. What are the applications and services? So we think that one of the most important, tactics that we've seen in this process is to really begin with a well-defined governance program, ensure that you have the right sets of roles and responsibilities created, but then start small. Don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to answer the question of everything that I could possibly, define. Start with a limited set of capabilities or a limited scope of your business and build from there. And as you're doing that, it's really important that you're striving continuously for what we would call digital dexterity. So the ability to ensure that the approach that you're taking can stand durably the test of time for change, because everything's going to change. Your design of controls are going to change, the applications and data sets that you need to manage are going to change, the controls themselves, and if you're regulated, the regulations will change, and of course, people will change in that process as well. So incredibly important part of the overall design of a strong and well-defined governance program for security as code is going to be that it's been designed in a form that it really does support the ability to ensure that change can occur at any different point in the process or any different point in the program, but it can be flexible and adaptive to that. So when we think about governance for cloud and a security role and responsibility structure, we start with obviously the fact that there are many different elements of security and responsibility and permission. So on this picture, you'll see here, obviously at the very bottom for each CSP, there'll be different services. There'll be ultimately an IAM type program where you can define roles and responsibilities, but within the context of that cloud provider. So whether it be Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, there'll be services and capabilities. And this is where the management of those really kind of begins to step into your side of the shared accountability model. So ensuring that the right people have the right set of controls to do the right things in any given cloud provider is an essential part of building kind of a least privilege and a permissions-based program for operating your cloud. And I think most of you hopefully have that in a path that you've really been able to build and design for that. It's often a challenge, and when you start getting into multi-cloud and supporting that across different cloud providers, that it certainly adds to the complexity problem. But what we're going to talk about today is how you can also define above that, and what we have focused on in Concourse, which is really the governance framework for security as code. So a layer that really defines for you in a cloud agnostic perspective, what are the different roles that are responsible or participating in the overall governance of your security as code program. Who within those roles is actually assigned the ability to do what types of responsibilities. And then lastly, what is their scoping in terms of their jurisdiction? So over what part of your cloud are they able to make those types of decisions or have those types of responsibilities? So all three of these components become a very important layer in the design, the implementation of a security as code governance policy. And it's important too, because what we often see with customers as we work with people is that the ability to kind of think in terms of the underlying cloud provider is often orthogonal to the way your business operates. So you don't necessarily think about the people that are going to be defining the permissions for necessarily cloud provider A versus B. You think about the people that are providing or defining things like what is your policy for perhaps the EMEA region versus the US region or globally for your firm. And so this ability to think and design a governance framework to really empower that to be ultimately cross-cloud, but ultimately being linked much more to how you think about your businesses, how you drive and operationalize your own usage of cloud is often something that again is going to be very multi-cloud in nature, and therefore having a framework that supports that can span across the different cloud providers and provides effectively a consistent but durable view on how your governance has been implemented is incredibly important in helping both operationalize your use of public cloud and to support their ability to operate on your side of the shared accountability model in a much more scalable and efficient way. So as we step into some of the examples with what we've at Concourse have looked at, how do you think about what are some of the major roles within the context of the governance framework for cloud? We see a couple here that we've kind of identified and brought this as a subset of the full set of roles that we support within Concourse, but we thought it was illustrative and useful for just as an example. So we'll see in here, we'll see things like the administrator. So who's responsible for administrating the governance process and community, so that can have different types of responsibilities like initiating and setting up base controls, creating and assigning virtual topologies. We then look at examples of like identity administrators, so who's allowed to make decisions of who's in which groups and which people can be added or removed from groups. Down into roles like the control author, who is actually allowed to manage policy, who's allowed to write policy, who's allowed to change or test or accept or approve policy changes. So these are all going to be examples of responsibilities that will fit within a role structure that, again, in our experience is very important to be thought through and be implemented in a way that's fairly holistic, that can support, again, durability and change, but also support and become effectively scaffolding. So as you think about, you may have in your environment, many people who are control authors, some that may be writing controls that are purely associated with their individual applications or perhaps a regional domain in your company, and some some who are writing controls that may be firm-wide, that may be part of a team that can ultimately dictate more corporate policy. Having consistency, however, like that's the role, that's the responsibility, and then talking about how you can provide access-based associations to jurisdictions of your cloud really creates that basis where you can now, as you learn, as you grow, as you modify and change your governance, that it creates that agility and that dexterity that supports the ability to change, add, but having consistency in the role and responsibility definitions. We also have on this, examples where, beyond the control teams themselves, where we increasingly see the need and the desire for people to participate in this security as code governance who may not be directly involved in the creation of controls, but they could be owners of your applications or business authors, as we call them, or business operators or DevOps type people, where ultimately the ability to see and know and get access and transparency and visibility into the controls and the changes of the controls and perhaps the documentation of why those controls were necessary really creates a very fulsome ability to manage effectively, across both the control side of the equation and the actual business and innovation side of the equation in a way that really reflects, the way that most people are operating in the cloud, which is, as my team, always reminds me, it's a team sport, and so everybody's going to be involved in different ways, creating the basis for everyone, therefore, to participate in governance in a well-defined structure, both increases responsibility, defines and creates trust, and ultimately enables for the complexities of most complex environments. We talked a lot about access-based association. This is an example of how we can really kind of hopefully bring that a bit more to the forefront. So having a definition of role and responsibility is great, but in many organizations, the problem becomes, how do I define the coverage, or maybe I'm a control author, again, that's sitting in a global security team, and therefore I have the scope and jurisdiction to provide controls that are going to impact everybody in the firm. Or maybe I'm someone that's working much more in a localized application team, or part of perhaps a regional group that's going to have a different degree of scope. And so the capabilities to take the ABAC structure, the role and responsibilities, which creates fundamental clarity of accountability, and then bring it conditionally into what becomes similar to your access-based controls, where you can define what is the actual scope of those responsibilities in a way that's dynamic, that can support, again, the ability to change over time as your usage of cloud changes. And so at Concourse, we focus very much on this problem of really the identification of a abstraction for how you can associate role and responsibility to what we call surfaces, but those surfaces act as a segmentation model for supporting the scoping of those responsibilities. So you can answer the question of who are policy authors in my company, but over which components of my cloud, what is their span of responsibility, what is their jurisdiction, which particular applications or which particular segments of my cloud do they have the ability to write policy that's valid for, and which, of course, the opposite, do they not? And so that capability to really enable an access-based model to enforce or amplify the role-based model we find as essential. Again, many companies will have a lot of challenges of identifying a single person or a single group that makes decisions across the board. The important thing, in our opinion and in our experience, is really facilitating and supporting the ability to operationalize your governance by really supporting the ability to bring it down to a level that actually is practical, that is pragmatic, that is maps more to the way that you work or the way you aspire to work, but recognizes the fact that there's going to be complexity, and there'll be different degrees of jurisdictional management that is necessary. And ultimately, this is where we end up with this approach, as we support, and fundamentally the governance model helps build the scaffolding that supports the ability to get to where you can think about right-sizing your governance for success. So you can think about governance of your cloud as less of some big, overarching problem that has to be, solved somewhere, and make it much more pragmatic, where you can, you view it as a collection of right-sized governance frameworks that really fit to the shape and the size of your business today, that supports the ability as it grows and changes to be very dynamic in its nature that creates that degree of clarity of both the role and responsibility structure, but also brings the operationalization of that and the implementation of that into what is the right-sized responsibility structure for your business, which will be different, than other people's businesses. And it's, something again that has tremendous amount of diversity in the industries. And within this, therefore, you can end up with a space where if you think about taking the governance model and virtualizing it into much smaller pieces that ultimately all share the same foundational principles, but have the ability to support different shapes and sizes, that it makes it much more pragmatic to get to a solution. But who is allowed to do which types of things? What's the RBAC over which parts of my cloud, the ABAC, for what types of policies, what types of applications, and which part of my cloud scope becomes a very virtuous surface that can be managed and really facilitates the ability to effectively both build and then operate your cloud governance for security as code. And all of this, of course, is not just done because we think it sounds like a great idea to do. It's done because what you create through this process is you're creating, therefore, effectively at an enterprise level, you're creating what becomes a system of truth for all of your rules and who's made those rules, and a system of trust to verify that those rules are correct. And having that system of truth and record and source of trust in a way that supports the ability now to really enable automation, that you can answer questions like, is this service allowed to be operating here? Is this something that I think is supposed to be occurring? So as we really bring the policy aspect of security as code and the implementation aspect into the picture, which we'll cover that more in the next couple of episodes, that this governance structure really creates that framework for having a single place that is a trusted source of truth for what are the rules that must be true in order to really operate your business, who are the people that were able to define those rules, who's allowed to be accessing the content that's there, so we can build effectively that meta layer that really supports the ability to fundamentally support automation at scale in your environment, be able to answer questions through an API call that would otherwise today need to route through multiple human beings in order to get answers to what's the appropriateness of this versus that, or who should be allowed to do this versus that. So this is really the objective that we're going to get to, and we'll cover again more of that in some of the following sessions as well to help complete the picture. So I know we've gotten a lot in a short period of time. We've designed these episodes to try and be, very tight and really kind of, give you a very, hopefully a quick but impactful glimpse. So, key takeaways for those of you out there who are looking to build and establish a security as code program. The first, which is that, beyond the fact that security as code is such an important and necessary strategy for any institution that's really beginning to go into or already is, implementing a multi-cloud hybrid strategy. So moving everything over time into what becomes an automated continuous control architecture is necessary for success. But how do you do that is, of course, the hard thing. So, first piece of advice, number one, recognize right away that getting this governance piece right is essential. That, we've worked with many companies and we've seen through our own experiences in our team, how difficult it is at times to come back and retrofit a really thoughtful governance model after you've already started, and gotten deep into how you're operationalizing and running your cloud. So if you have the opportunity to start from the beginning, absolutely start here first. Make sure that you are defining a taxonomy of the roles and responsibilities and permissions that are going to establish a foundation for you to get to where you can basically have a trusted data set of both what the rules are that your business operates, and then the association of those rules down into the actual code implementations. Second, make sure that you, as you're approaching that, just take an agile approach to governance. The biggest failure model that we've seen, or mode, has been trying to start too large, trying to get to, a definition of what my rules are and my policies are that are so expansive that it's almost impossible to make progress. So really taking both that agile approach of we're going to be continuously improving and expanding on what we do, but also taking that segmentation based approach of start, with a good, taxonomy and governance structure, but start with a part of your organization and look to expand that over time, has been very, very important and ultimately a key success factor to companies that we've seen that have actually been able to implement over time a very strong model for security as code governance. And think about that across the way of really defining this in a path that as you expand the number of people who are involved in governance, as you start to build out with your role structure, more than just, purely kind of the control side of their business, but also getting deeper into the developer application business, owners, that it creates a framework for both leadership. It creates an ability to engage people in a very positive way. And so we think that there's also been a very important, after effect of having both, more people involved in governance, which is, perhaps a necessary thing no matter what, but having the ability to do that in a way that really facilitates the role responsibility structure, drives much more thought leadership, and has ultimately, in our experience, led to exponentially greater results for companies that have taken this approach. So that's our coverage today in terms of episode 1. As I mentioned, episode 2, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be coming back with some more episodes that will focus on other parts of the 3 pillars. But we're excited to have the opportunity again to speak with you today, and I really look forward to your questions. So thank you.